This conference will now be recorded.
All right, good afternoon and welcome to the third installment of the APA-KY Sponsor Spotlight Series, a month-long series of continuing education opportunities that provide a look at some of the projects and planning topics of interest to planning professionals from across the state. I'm APA Kentucky President Brian Davis, and I'll be your host today. Today's session, The Future is Resilient, is presented to us by our friends at Gresham Smith. Just a reminder, these sessions are CM certified and available for credit through the My APA section of planning.org by searching for the session title or the session number. The session number is 920-6457. If you didn't get that, don't worry about it. I'll be posting a link to the session in the chat section, so keep your eyes open for that. A couple of ground rules for today's meeting. Number one, be sure to keep your microphone muted unless you're asking a question. Number two, you can turn your camera off if you'd like. And number three, feel free to use the chat function to ask questions during the presentation, or you can wait until the end to ask questions then. So at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Lewis Johnson and Matt McLaren from Gresham Smith. Lewis and Matt, the virtual floor is yours.
Thanks, Brian. And like Brian said, I'm Lewis Johnson. I'm a project executive with Gresham Smith. My background's in landscape architecture and urban design. I'm from Louisville. I've been working in and around the region for over a decade now. I've reached that point where I can just say that and leave it at that. We're really excited to be here today. And I think I work and our office works on a lot of things at a lot of different scales, a lot of different types of planning related projects, some that maybe are more kind of design focused, but I think the relationships back to the planning world in Kentucky especially are critical. And so we wanted to share some of kind of our thoughts on resiliency and how resiliency can be baked into our work today. And I brought with me Matt, who's our super genius civil engineer.
Thanks. My name is Matt McLaren. I am a civil engineer by trade. I grew up in Lexington, don't hold it against me. Lived down in Charlotte, North Carolina for about the first 10 or 11 years of my career, and then moved to Louisville. So currently I am the location leader for our land planning group out of the Lexington and Louisville offices. And I wear a lot of different hats. And so, I'll echo what Lewis said, which is, a lot of the work that we do, it all starts it all starts with plans, right? It all starts with a planning effort, regardless of what it is. And, it's a fact of life that resiliency is going to have to be more and more a forethought instead of an afterthought. So excited to give this presentation today.
Absolutely. So we're going to just jump right in here. Overall, I think our objective is to really start by thinking about what resilience is. I think we all have our own interpretations or definitions that we've read or maybe agree with or thought about. So I think we're going to kind of pose our ideas about that and really kind of what resilience should mean for our work. I think at all kind of different levels and scales. And then talk about how we've seen resilience be applied to different projects from different scales, from small single site all the way up to 100-mile trail master plans. So we'll be kind of running through those sorts of case studies from our personal experience. I wanted to start with this definition of resilience that was given by the National Society of Professional Engineers. I think this is kind of the most readily or kind of basic accepted definition for what resilience is. It's the ability to prepare and plan for, absorb, recover from, and more successfully adapt to adverse events. Now, when I read this, to me, that's very much focused on kind of a singular event, the flood that happens, or a catastrophic tornado or storm event, that how can we prepare to deal with that one thing? And I think through our work, and because I'm a total nerd about all of this stuff, through a lot of the things that I've read, and these are actual books that I've just read that I thought were personally interesting, that kind of expanded how I thought about resilience, is I think it needs to be broader than that. Thinking about these huge environmental systems, huge social systems, economic systems, and how all of these things ultimately interrelate and need to be thought of in our work, because we're always kind of touching multiple aspects of the communities that we work within. And one in particular, back here, the Too Big book, if you're not familiar with the Rebuild by Design program, that is one thing in particular that I've been really interested in and thought did a really nice job of adding to this definition. So I think the way that the Rebuild by Design program added is, in addition to basically what we said before, in addition to reducing risk, it's really about delivering multiple benefits, including air, water quality, social cohesion, new job or economic opportunities, access to public spaces or more like natural environments, among many other things. So that's a much kind of broader, holistic approach to thinking about what resilience might mean. And they go on to talk about the kind of complex and multifaceted nature of resilience. And if anybody is on Twitter, I recently just deleted my Twitter app off my phone just to see what would happen. But before that, I was kind of following things, whether they were in Louisville or in Kentucky or nationally, thinking about all the different challenges that we're all facing, from climate change to the things that are happening in our communities right now with COVID, with massive social unrest, that's centered in our own community here in Louisville, and thinking about all of these different things that are impacting people's lives. And what I think Henk Ovink, he was really the kind of key person behind the Rebuild by Design program, he goes on to describe that complexity that I think we all understand, all of these disparate systems, that complexity actually demands a new approach to our work, and one that steps outside of existing frameworks and agreements based on assumptions that we were making in the past. So how much rain should we expect in a year? How many hurricanes and how strong should they be? All of those sorts of things were assumptions, and I think we need to be rethinking those sorts of elements. And for me personally, again, as an unabashed landscape architect, I come back to this notion of, we always hear people talk about the natural stuff that's over there. And I think it's really important for us as we continue our work to really understand that we are in fact we are nature. We are not a part from nature. We've taken a bunch of these great photos. As much as we want to be apart from nature at times, it's just not real. We're all just a part of one system, and so we should start thinking that way. And we really need to be redefining that relationship with these kind of broader ecological systems, recognizing human roles in these systems. And frankly, instead of kind of working in spite of them and trying to overcome them, we start working within them. I'm thinking about the layers that make up resilience. So you could hear that talked about, like the triple bottom line approach, I think is one way that people describe that. I like to think about societal, ecological, economic, and the other layers of things that we know are happening. And that's different, and that's kind of a thick matrix of things that need to be addressed in our projects at all times. And we have to always be, and I think this is important, and this is how we've kind of, I think, tried to weave this into our personal practice, is that those layers and those systems should always be considered, whether we're talking about doing one small corner parcel development all the way up through a really big, park master plan. We can always be thinking about these multiple systems at once. And again, by understanding that we're not separate from nature, I love this photo. This is down near Waterfront Park in Louisville, because we will be reminded that we cannot be separate as much as we want to be, that resilience becomes an imperative. And I think that helps allow our work to be inclusive and more forward thinking. So with that kind of as our baseline understanding, we're going to walk through 4 projects. Matt will get us started. We're going to kind of go from scale, from smallest up to largest, and they're all pretty different types of work. And we'll roll through those, and then we'll do a little bit of Q&A. And I'll do my best, Matt, to advance the slides in a timely fashion.
No worries. Thank you so much. The first project, as he said, we're going to kind of start small and then work big. So this was a group of projects that we did with a great client partner of ours, a private developer multifamily, so Frontier Highway stormwater retrofits. The project started with an LFUCG stormwater grant effort to come up with these guides that were basically toolboxes for multifamily and other types of commercial development. You know, so many of these projects were built in the 70s and they've sat there, and there's been little to no investment in them. And so, you know, a lot of this goes back to that triple bottom line thing. So, you know, how can we spend some money, grant money in this case, to improve stormwater, but also improve the, you know, the space that the tenants get to improve the society of these multifamily deals. The ecological, obviously, that's the main target with the stormwater, but also the economic. So, you know, but the nicer you make these developments, the more rent you're going to get, the more you're going to fund the development. So, you know, our goal with these studies was, how can we go back and revitalize these projects instead of ripping them down and building something new, which is obviously extremely disruptive. So, just a little bit of background. All of these projects were located in the Royal Springs Aquifer in Lexington, Kentucky. So stormwater quality there is absolutely critical and paramount, because that is the drinking supply for Georgetown, Kentucky. So everything that you do in that region directly affects the residents of Georgetown, because that's where they get their water. So just a little unique piece of that. You can see, and I'm going to lean in real tight. So the case study areas were all in Northeast Lexington. But again, you can see that orange, which is all of the existing multifamily around town. So while we only studied a small piece that was in the aquifer, this is equally applicable to everything within Lexington and any other community for that matter. None of this stuff was, you know, geared explicitly toward Lexington. With this particular study, we looked at 3 different projects for this client. We looked at a large one, which is the 150 Northland. It's your typical multi-building parking lot, drive aisles, you know, kind of deal. We also looked at one of the medium-sized properties, which was the 900 block, which was 4 single-family buildings that had been converted to duplexes, triplex, and quadplex. And along with that the small project to the right, North Lime, it was unique to me that, looking back, all the space in the rear of these buildings that would have been a green backyard had been converted into gravel parking to support the tenants. So, you know, right off, those were our, you know, kind of prime area where the target opportunities. So, yeah, so, you know, it all goes back to making a plan. So when we first started this project, the first thing we did was look around for opportunities that we could look at. So, you know, the first one is the excessive drive aisles. You can see that, you know, based on scale with the parking spaces, there was a ton of asphalt out here that nobody needed. It wasn't striped for parking. It wasn't needed for emergency turns or anything like that. So that was a prime opportunity. It cost money whenever they rehabbed the parking lot or seal coated it. Unless you were a car, you weren't hanging out there. It wasn't a space that, you know, helped improve the fabric of the tenants and the society out there. And ecologically, it didn't allow for infiltration, and, you know, asphalt runoff is one of the worst pollutants. So, you know, that was a low-hanging fruit. We also looked a little bit more at the, you know, it says there, the non-functional landscape. So when this was developed, perhaps it had a reason, it had a thought, but over the years it had become non-functioning space. And, you know, one of the most prime examples of that was the pool deck. You know, based on current tenant needs, it just wasn't getting used. It was a little bit in disrepair. So that was a prime opportunity. Next. So taking the kind of planner, big picture hat off, putting on the engineer hat, we started to look at the drainage patterns of the site. How can we collect water based on where it wants to go today? There's no point in reinventing the wheel or fighting gravity. So how do we work with it, and where are those opportunity places? Luckily, I don't think I can point, but you can see in the top up there by the pool deck, while it's at the top of the site, we were getting a lot of roof runoff going right toward it. The other was that non-functional landscape area where, again, we were getting a lot of roof runoff. So those asphalt shingles, they do have a fair amount of pollution. So, you know, those were 2 obvious areas. And then the roadways around it, you know, that asphalt was prime target for rehab. You know, just to kind of give you an idea, that pool area, just before and after coming up here in a little bit as we go through it. Again, this was one of those areas where we felt like we could spend that same dollar 3 times and really get the most bang for our buck. So, kind of big picture, we started looking at this area. We were looking at roofs. We were looking at how can we get that stormwater in there. We were also looking at what else can that area be. It didn't need to just be a stormwater facility. So you can see we've got a lawn gathering area. We've got some seating around that. So we had a thought. We had a plan. So if you go to the next one, once we kind of got people to buy into that, we could really dig in and we could really detail what we were going to do. So we had, each tenant had a little patio next to their unit, so we could see how this communal space was going to relate to their personal space. We had the BMPs with the vegetation in there. These were going to become biofiltration areas with vegetated plantings. And then, most importantly, we're going to build that gathering lawn. So where it used to be a aquatic pool, it was going to become a flat gathering area that could be used for a multitude of different things. Go ahead. Oh, gotcha. So this is post-construction. A couple of things that actually, if you could flip back one slide. So as we were doing this, we had a fixed construction budget. So going into it from the very first slide, we knew exactly how much we had to spend on construction. And so one of the interesting things about this project was we were always costing our proposed development. So a lot of times when we do cool renderings like this, you get the cost back on construction and it's crazy. If you go to the next slide again, you can see, these plants were just put in the ground, but I feel like it really ended up getting constructed true to the original vision. And we knew we were on the right path when the day the contractor ripped the pool out and then backfilled it flat. We had to wait a little bit to get another permit. Immediately, people were out there using that new flat vegetated area for a gathering space, playing soccer, doing all the things that we said they were going to do with that area. So that was really enlightening and reassuring that we were on the right path. So, you can see here, you got the bioretention facilities ringing the seat walls, you got that lawn area to gather, you can see the interaction between the units and this area. So it really brings a lot of life to what was once a dead space. And yes, I have always worked for landscape architects, and so that's how I don't talk like an engineer always.
For people with good eyes, you can see nature's coming back on the right side where the cat is in the bioswale. He's here.
Indeed. Can't get rid of them. One of the big pieces, two things about this. One, this is a stormwater grant project, so education, teaching people about stormwater is obviously a really important component. So there is educational signage all over the place, helping people understand what they're using and its function back to the environment. The other reason I really like this picture is I feel like even though we did have a fairly tight construction budget, I don't feel like we skimped on materials. I feel like this has a really high-end finished look to it. And it's also a very durable product. So I think that this is going to hold up over the long term, and it's going to continue to bring that resilience and that triple bottom line kind of feel and usefulness to this. One of the other really cool parts about this project is the owner had a really good feel for how many parking spaces they needed, and that's probably not going to be real normal for a developer to say, yeah, you can feel free to take a few of those parking spaces out. But in this particular case, this area was not being used for parking typically. We didn't need it to meet code. And we had too much pavement out there. So we were able to take this kind of pre-developed condition. And again, this was the vision that we had going into it. So we turned it into a gathering area. This is near the end of the development. So it was an area where people could gather and not get a ton of traffic going through. It picked up, again, roof drainage and parking lot drainage, two of the worst polluters out there. And, again, this was one of those standard bioretention facilities that we put in the ground. Go ahead. And it creates, again, a really nice area, and I think it does everything we were trying to do. Go one more. And really one of the coolest things, I think, is we took what was used to be some of the typical but not great apartments where you had cars parked, you had lights shining in, you had bumpers literally like 5 feet from your wall. Now these particular units, they look out onto a vegetated area, they don't have cars shining into it, so it really brings a lot of value to those units. And I wish we could do this more throughout the rest of the development, but this was an area where we had some extras parking. And you can see a nice pavilion was built down there to really enhance that gathering area.
Yeah, I think one maybe piece to wrap this up, and the manuals that Matt described at the beginning, we have both of those available. I think both of them, definitely the multifamily one, available on our website, and I think they're available through LFUCG's website also. Is this idea of, with green infrastructure, that it not be an afterthought, or that you not just simply kind of bury the infrastructure underground, or put the detention basin off in the corner to where it's just doing its one job. I think the point that we're trying to make here, and I have a very cheesy tagline for it, like I do with most things, is thinking about BMP, so best management practice amenities. So BMP amenities, how can we add value? How can you always add, and that's not just economic value, but thinking back to that sort of dilapidated pool that wasn't offering anything to the residents, that now they have a place where they can come together and hopefully build stronger social ties and have a place to go with their families and that sort of thing. And these are lower rate, they're not affordable technically, but I think they're much lower rate rental apartments where these sorts of amenities aren't typically found. So the only way that this happened was by thinking creatively about how stormwater infrastructure could be used to make a project happen that otherwise, wouldn't normally happen.
Absolutely. So moving to a different sense of scale, this was the Connecting Beargrass Creek project here in Louisville. This was done as one of the legacy project for the Congress for New Urbanism National Conference that was held here in Louisville last year. Thank you to our friends, the Brown Family Foundation and MSD, as well as countless others who helped on this, Kentucky Waterway Alliance also. This was a project where we wanted to study something really big and look at what can we do over the long term to really make a big difference. So we bid off the Beargrass Creek South Fork watershed, which is, if you know Louisville much, obviously a really important and critical corridor within the city. It goes all the way from the Ohio River, which is super dense urban downtown, all the way out to the zoo, which gets more of a suburban feel. So it has a really large gamut of types of development around it, but for the most part, it is built up to the edge of the creek. So kind of statistically, 26 square miles, about 60% impervious. So there is a lot of stormwater runoff that is going to this creek. Go ahead.
One of the data points that I always like to point out is, I think it's somewhere in the 25%, 20 to 25% impervious surfaces means that you're starting to show pretty extreme stream degradation, and stream health can be determined based on that number alone. And here we're talking about 60%. So I think that's an important number to kind of keep in mind, especially when you're looking at such a big area. It's just massive.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of it was built out before there was a lot of stormwater regulations. So you're unfortunately getting a lot of untreated stormwater. So again, the idea was, we want really big ideas, don't get hemmed in by all the stuff that we typically say, oh, you can't do that because of this or that, but also built on incremental action of, okay, these are the big ideas where we want to get to, but what are the little things that we can do now to set the precedent and make that happen? So these are just some pictures of the different pieces of the stream as you go, working upstream and downstream. So the project started off with a creek crawl, distant relative of the pub crawl. And so started at the downstream end and we kind of worked our way out. So this is one of the more urban pieces of the stream. This is a concrete, for all lack, it is a concrete ditch right down through there. So, they've built the walls out of concrete, the channels out of concrete, and as it floods and as the water comes up, it keeps moving down through there. But you can see already people have used it as a canvas. They're using it for art, public art, and some people call it graffiti. But anyway, so the idea was to experience the creek in all of its pieces. And that was done throughout the first part of the day. And if I didn't mention it, this was a 3-day process. So we took what would have been weeks or months worth of work and condensed it down, into those 3 days. So the first part was getting an assessment of what was out there today.
And one of the, I think, really important elements for all of these, really, because you saw it in the first one with some of the educational signage and things here, and ideas like creek crawl, it's really getting people to these places to see it. Because what I thought was really cool is when we did this, there was a lot of people from MSD, from Kentucky Waterways, people who I would have thought on the face of it, they're the stream experts, they're stormwater people who are really passionate and care a lot about this. And we were able to take a number of them to places that they had never been or seen. And, even in this condition, we're kind of struck by it because, oftentimes this infrastructure, you can tell we're standing on a bridge. You never see it. You just drive over it or walk past it. You don't really give it much thought. And I think that's one of these things is how we can reconnect back to these systems to help create that value and that connection.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So with that kind of experience of what was out there, then came back and really did a big visioning session where you take all those thoughts that you've been writing down all morning, kind of, sorry, computer's beeping at me, get those ideas down, stick them out there, really collaborate. There was a huge spectrum of people who were working on this from, stormwater people like me to the public that lived around the creek, plenty of public agencies, people who are interested, and people who were in town for the conference. So there was tons of different viewpoints and ideas. And then the idea was, again, come up with the big ideas and the small ideas. And these were just a kind of a sample of a few of the ones. I really like the spread here of, let's reduce the impervious surfaces by 50%. Well, that is an amazing goal, and I would love to see that happen. But that is just, it's a tremendous undertaking. But even down to the little things like build ramps for the turtles so they can get in and out easier. It must have been somebody saw some turtle down there who was struggling to get out of the channel. And it's funny because a lot of people actually latch onto that and want to see that one happen right away. So the spread of ideas was truly amazing that came out of it. So, one of the big things was, where are some of the nodes that could happen for a lot of different reasons. On the downstream end, you're anchored by the Butchertown Greenway. And then as you kind of work your way up, there's several developments that are already along the creek that have potential. And working out to the more suburban, there's a lot of places where you can get down into the creek more easily. But the big thing is, like Lewis said, is how do we get people to stop turning their back on the creek and embrace it and see it for what it is? And these were some opportunities that were identified through there. And the incremental actions, a podcast tour, the turtle ramps, boating events down through the creek. How do you treat the buffers along it in a more native way? How do you promote native plants instead of invasives? And I'm always impressed by when we do things like this, the ideas that people come up with for the tactical urbanism. What are those projects that can be done quickly, inexpensively, that build momentum for the bigger projects coming up? So that's what I always am amazed by, is just the thoughts that people come up with. Joe Creason Park, this is at the very upstream end, and this is where we had not very many of those constraints. Like, we didn't have development on all the sides, and it was, again, just kind of thinking, okay, how can we improve the floodplain? How can we improve the educational opportunities? And came up with a vision of what it could be, not what it should be, but this was just a pie in the sky idea of, here's what it was, here's how we could really improve it and make something really cool out of this area. Go ahead. And with that, I will turn it over to Lewis.
So this one, Broadway All the Way, we're leading a team, a multidisciplinary team right now. Actually, the project's underway here in Louisville, looking at all of the Broadway corridor. This project is in progress, so this is really just kind of the beginning. But I think when we think about, or when I think about resiliency related projects, I think people often go to softer, more landscape driven, stormwater driven sorts of projects versus things like roadways and corridors and that sort of thing. And so I think this was one good example. Here's a map of the study area. It's roughly 6 miles all the way to the west to Shawnee Park and Southwestern Parkway, to the east at Baxter Avenue and Cave Hill Cemetery, for those of you that are familiar. Broadway is probably, we could argue semantics, but I think it's probably, if not the most important roadway, one of the most important roadways in our entire city. You could see this is, I think that's 9th Street right below at the front end of the camera looking east down, but you could see what Broadway is. And this is a pretty typical condition as far as the right-of-way. It's an enormous roadway. And it's always been an enormous roadway for a lot of reasons. But I think it's, the city saw the need to really be rethinking, and the city with partners like TARC, KYTC, the Downtown Partnership, and others really saw the opportunity to rethink how Broadway works. So I think Broadway's been working one way for a really long time, and needed to be reevaluated because, again, of that importance to the community. So I think one of the things that we felt was really important when we're thinking about corridors, we might call this a complete streets project. And so we wanted to really expand internally to our team, but through this project, how we think about what a complete street really means, and not just think about within the roadway itself. That complete street doesn't mean just bikes, pedestrians, cars, and trucks. We wanted to start thinking about that vertically also. So to really have a complete street, what's underground, thinking about utility infrastructure and resilience there. We know Broadway, MSD's really old sewer pipe underneath, it's a brick line sewer that's failing in places, is down there. And we need to be prepared for, or allow for, future technologies to come in, thinking about fiber internet and all these other things that we couldn't possibly even anticipate now. So how do we build in that sort of ability for growth? Again, green infrastructure. So how can our roadways, which make up huge amounts of the impervious surfaces in our city, how can those really start to help treat the water that we're putting into pipes? And along Broadway, which is a great example of tons of combined sewer overflow, flood-prone areas, and how can we use the roadway and the corridor itself to help start to address and improve those things? But other things like economic opportunity, access to jobs, so transit, people's ability to move around a city plays a huge role in their access to economy. We'll talk about that maybe a little bit more here in a minute when we get to some of the maps, but I think that's a really big deal. And then, other, ecological services. So in Louisville, we know huge urban heat island impacts and all these other things that we need to be thinking about that really truly make up what a complete street might be, or a complete Broadway might be in the future. For this project in particular, we're following the framework that the city has developed through the CHASE principles, through the city's Plan 2040 and the comp plan, connected, healthy, authentic, sustainable, and equitable, which I think, again, is kind of another way of approaching sort of a triple bottom line approach. So really thinking about these kind of multiple systems and how they all land here. And in some of our early research, we tried to pull out some of this information to really help people think broadly, again, about what the potential of this corridor is. So when we think about connectivity for Broadway, or for any of our roadways in our cities and counties throughout the state, TARC Route 23, which is the route that runs up and down Broadway, carries 1.5 million people a year. I tell people who don't ride buses that, and they're astounded because they don't think about it. They think nobody rides the bus. That's just not true, especially on Broadway. That 6,400 people board a bus along Broadway every day. I think we'll see the map here in a second, but the number of routes that converge on Broadway is huge. This next one was my personal favorite. The map, which was a little bit too big to reasonably put into like megabytes, too big to put into a presentation because it would break everything, was the scooter data. The city was great and got us all of their scooter data. And in just 1 year, there were over 30,000 scooter trips that touched Broadway, which that number to me was just shocking. And not just because it's 30,000 scooter trips, so I can't picture like 30,000 scooters, but the fact that Broadway is built almost entirely in a way that does not encourage people to ride a scooter. So from thinking about, ADA accessibility, the traffic speeds, the danger that you would face as a person on a scooter, we've done everything we can to make it an environment that you wouldn't want to ride it, and still 30,000 trips were made that touched it. So that to me says there's this latent demand that's just waiting to go if we could get the right infrastructure in there to let people do it safely and comfortably. And then not forgetting, the huge amount of car volume and other traffic that's there, especially downtown, the folks who are coming in on the highway, that are commuting in for their jobs, or going, we have major economic centers with the health district that's downtown's core, et cetera. So the huge amounts of traffic that also need to be dealt with in a reasonable way. Here you can see some of these quickie diagrams, again, looking and trying to position Broadway across the entire county, across Jefferson County. So in that first one, you see the major employment hubs of the county. And why that's really particularly important is the folks who live along Broadway, especially West Louisville and the neighborhoods right along the corridor, are typically the folks who are getting on the bus or commuting out to these more suburban employment centers. And so Broadway is a key piece of that, but also thinking about, Indianapolis, Nashville, Lexington, other regional cities that are bringing things to our city are generally getting off the highway and at some point probably touching Broadway. It's a major way for us to kind of get goods in and out of the city. When we think about the bus routes, like I mentioned before, you could see that just spaghetti of bus routes that we have, and how important Broadway is and Route 23 is within that so many routes touch Broadway, including the new Dixie Highway BRT line that's coming through, and that critical connection as well. And then thinking broadly about multimodal, bike facilities, Broadway has the ability to connect to the Louisville Loop. So in theory, you could be on Broadway and get on the loop and go anywhere around the edge of the entire county if you wanted to. And so thinking about how those systems are all integrated is also important. We like to take kind of a broad perspective definition of when we think about health. I think health's a really kind of particularly interesting topic. So there's the really literal health about roadways when we think about safety. Broadway in particular, the crash numbers, and I'm not a transportation engineer, but in my limited experience dealing with crash data, the crash numbers aren't hugely high, but what is really high is the number that result in injuries. And that's often because of speed, but it's also because if there's a lot of people walking, that we're putting more people at risk. So you can see the 20% of those involved were bicyclists and pedestrians. So when we think about, and I think this is a great kind of thing to think about in the moment that we're all in right now with COVID and the challenges that we're faced, especially early on, but I think still with TARC and people not feeling comfortable enough to get on a bus, or thinking about people needing and wanting to walk and bike more places, but then we're putting people into an environment where they're at high risk of injury if they get into a wreck, right? So, and that's really dramatically impacting people that have lower incomes, less modal choice. So thinking about the resiliency in our transportation networks from that perspective is critical. And you can see here on these maps, those pedestrian incidents and where they lie. If you know Louisville, west of 9th Street is what everybody, determines or has deemed sort of the divide, West Louisville and East Louisville. And I think over half of the high pedestrian incident areas were in West Louisville. There's the other kind of key spots around 4th Street and around 2nd and 1st Street, which is near JCTC and the school. There's a whole lot of foot traffic there, which is why that's happening. So thinking about those hotspots. And then also we did a lot of walking and touring around thinking about things like access management. And, when we all know as our cities plan and grow, it happens incrementally over time. Over 100 or so years of growth, we have a hodgepodge of things that have happened that have resulted in really, in this case, a pretty poor pedestrian environment that's quite complex and not very accessible. And when we think about social cohesion, as a part of resiliency, I kind of lean into this, the authenticity of what Broadway is. I think one of the challenges for Broadway is there's not a lot of people that kind of own Broadway as a place. It's not like a neighborhood plan where people say, I'm from X, Y, or Z neighborhood. I own this. I really am invested in what's going to happen here. Broadway is something that touches a lot of different places. So it's kind of simultaneously everybody's and nobody's, which is a challenge. Here in Louisville, 11 different neighborhoods touch it, and they're extremely diverse. And there's others that are really close. The roadway was actually intended originally to be a part of Louisville's Olmsted Parkways, which would have, that you could imagine what that would have meant for the corridor and how it might have changed. And then, but it does connect still to some of the kind of really key open spaces in our city, and I think that's important as well. So here you could see some of those neighborhoods. I've always thought it was really interesting that Broadway has ended up being, if you look at, or if you're familiar with Louisville's neighborhoods, it's actually ended up being a boundary line between the two. So, between Russell and California and Shawnee and Chickasaw, Broadway is the thing that's between those. And especially from kind of Parkland east, the physical size of Broadway and the kind of the challenge that it poses for people to cross the street even is a pretty big deal. And it's become not only just like a map boundary, but a very literal boundary to people to go from one neighborhood to another. And I think that's another element of this plan, is thinking about how people move kind of north and south. It's also a big piece of how we could potentially be connecting open space, but also cultural fabric. So thinking about, Broadway's role in the Kentucky Derby parade, things like those sorts of moments. We used to have cruising on Broadway. We've seen this year protests on Broadway. Broadway is at the center of our city for a lot of different reasons, and it connects a lot of different, religious institutions up and down beautiful buildings, and really kind of key places for our kind of cultural fabric of our city. And so thinking about how that all relates is important. When I mentioned earlier about the kind of broad base of health, the other piece to me is the sustainability side. So thinking about air quality, urban heat island, water quality, all of those sorts of things that do have major impacts on people's health. We look at, it's a 6-mile corridor, but 6 miles of two sides of road, right? So 12 miles of streetscape with only 700 trees, and over a quarter of those are in poor health or dead. And if you really dig into it, and I'll pull up the map at the bottom, you can see kind of in that center, what's kind of center of the map, which is all west of 9th Street, really where it starts to get blank on the right side. There's almost 2 miles of street with no trees at all, if you total up the segments, which is an enormous amount, especially in a road that's that size. You could see that correlates really directly with the map at the very top, which is the urban heat island risk assessment. So everything that's red and orange is basically high and very high risk. That comes with lots of other kind of health indicating factors around asthma and all of those sorts of things, thinking about that, but also economic factors about how we heat and cool buildings, thinking about those elements. And the one in the middle, I think, also is particularly interesting, the sort of combined sewer overflow flood prone areas. So all those big gray blobs. You can see that, again, with the way that the sewer line is under Broadway, it's very shallow, and it all ends up down in the Ohio River. And there's a lot of capacity issues because of how impervious our city is. And those capacity issues are creating major problems, like around Maple Street, which is the biggest blob sort of in the middle, where houses have had to be bought and people had to be moved and displaced because of that flooding. So thinking about those interrelated things that are all along our corridor that we can't necessarily fix within Broadway, but I think it's important to continue to figure out how can we help improve and call attention to those issues. And then finally, thinking about equity. And so I've already talked about this a little bit, but thinking about that we are a major commuter route to some of those largest employment centers. And over the last decade, and this is a national statistic, the proximity of job centers to high poverty communities has declined by 61%. So we're putting people with the least modal choice further and further away from where they work. So they're spending more time traveling, less time at home, or less time at work. I know I can speak from personal experience riding TARC. I was on a bus going home with a guy who was going to work at Ford, and if he was late, he was going to lose his job. So there's major resiliency factors in transportation systems that not everybody appreciates. This isn't, I mean, that shouldn't be a question mark, but this isn't impacting everybody the same. This is impacting, in Louisville especially, our Black communities the most and people of color the most. And so that's an important thing to remember. And here, just thinking about, there are people without access to vehicles. It's important for folks to remember that, especially as we think about the future of transportation in Broadway. We went and talked to folks on the street. COVID's made these things extremely challenging, but we started these conversations at bus stops with people in the morning. And one of the things I'll never forget was just the theme that we heard, especially at this bus stops in West Louisville, about what was the biggest issue that you were facing. And a lot of folks talked about access to food, which I think when we talk about a complete street, access to food probably wasn't on our list of things that we needed to be thinking about, but that was clearly incorrect. And that had a lot more to do with the lack of groceries in West Louisville and the amount of time it would take for somebody to get to one that had what they needed. And so for folks with modal choice, where going 1 mile or 5 miles to get your food from a grocery store isn't a big deal, you might not think twice about it. For some folks, that's an enormous amount of time spent to just meet daily needs. And so things like that, I think, are really important when we're talking again about a holistic vision of resilience. I'm going to keep sliding through. And this was sort of really just a summary graphic of a lot of these kind of existing conditions things, but you could start to see the overlap of, the red circles being really dangerous intersections next to vacant buildings, and where we have a lot of those, especially again in West Louisville, flood prone areas and those sorts of things. So again, like Matt said, spend that same dollar 3 times. So how can the future of Broadway help address multiple issues at once? So we're being efficient with those major capital investments and really kind of thinking holistically about how we're addressing our communities and making them more resilient beyond just thinking about, the 1927 flood, right? And the way that we dealt with that. So the final project, and I'll try to buzz through this, is the Chattahoochee Riverlands. This is a project, we're actually, on this one, I'm gonna give a major shout out to Scape Landscape Architecture. They're a partner and collaborator of ours out of New York. They primed this project, but we worked very closely with them. So there's a ton of beautiful graphics in here that they really led and helped develop. And they really led the process. But this project, I think, was really interesting in that, if you're familiar with Atlanta or not, what we were tasked to do was come up with a master plan for this greenway system along the Chattahoochee River, which is and the study area was 100 miles. So we've now gone from 6 miles of Broadway to 100 miles in the Atlanta region. And that just by itself was kind of an overwhelming task, is to think about from end to end, how do you deal with all these different constituencies, the different needs, the different challenges that would be faced. We faced a lot of really kind of interesting similar challenges. I called, when we were going through it, the Berry Ice Creek project sort of the mini Chattahoochee, because the Chattahoochee River, Atlanta, I think, is the biggest city in the country not built directly on a river. And this image is one that I think exemplifies this part of the issue again, which is when you see the Chattahoochee, you see it and say, oh, there it goes, because you're on a highway or a road going 60 miles an hour. And there's not that many chances to get down to it unless you're in one of the big kind of state nature preserves or national parks. So that's a big challenge, is just, again, that access. But when you do get to it, it's astounding. It's fantastic. The Palisades along these places that people can get access to, which is very inequitable if you start to look at 100 miles of access where people can and cannot get access to it. But they have this system that is so important, and it's important not just, it's a very different sort of situation in that the amount of drinking water that's coming from this river for this city, but also for the folks that are south of it. So, Georgia and Alabama, all the way down into Florida, there's lots of big political discussions about, the water, access to that water, but also the quality of that water. That's a really big deal. As we got into this project, thinking about 100 miles and trying to bite it off into, chunks that are manageable, we divided it into 3 sub areas. Again, thinking about contextual approaches to planning across that 100 miles. The northern sub area, number 1, was really about the suburban parkland, so much more suburban in nature. So, large lot tract homes and subdivisions, golf courses, that sort of thing, but also a lot of the national parks and things that were happening up there. Sub-area 2, which is really more kind of the urban Atlanta side, was heavy industry along the river, especially. That's kind of where the river was most negatively impacted by industry back in the day, before our kind of major regulations, the Metropolitan River Protection Act and others were put in place. And then in sub-area 3 was sort of that transition out of that industrial into really major kind of rural, large lot, kind of farm, large tract homes, more kind of agricultural, single, one person owns huge hundreds of acres sorts of place down there. So all facing kind of very different contexts. I think for us, thinking again about resiliency and how we understand what resiliency would mean to all these different communities, we had to have a really robust public engagement strategy. We had the Chattahoochee Working Group, so there were I think 120 folks who were a part of the process that were built in. So we had check-ins with those folks regularly throughout. We met and did all kinds of driving tours and walking tours, met with tons of folks. We built a website that's still up. The Trust for Public Land, City of Atlanta, and Cobb County were the 3 main clients, and that's who really was driving it. And the Trust for Public Land is continuing to advance that, and the website's available with a lot more information. But we also held lots of different engagement events. Again, things like what we called river rambles, where we actually got people down onto or near the river. The image that's in the background here was focused on accessibility. So thinking about folks of all different abilities, we actually had a lot of our team members were in wheelchairs that were brought specifically to put our team members in wheelchairs to say, hey, here, how is this experience? What do you start to notice about that for trail access? Or in the case of the exercise that they're going through right now, the multi-sensory experience, rather than everything being all about sight. Maybe it's about smell, hearing, touch, those sorts of other elements. So thinking about that as well. The project had 4 main goals. The first, again, because it is a greenway trail, making a connective corridor. So increasing that water access. Where is that access? Thinking about those elements. Creating a more continuous public realm. Really thinking strategically about accessibility and safety. I think that was a big role for us in the transportation components, connecting to the train lines that are not quite there, and how we get people to promote these kind of healthier and safer kind of modes of transportation along the river itself, but also get people to that water so that, again, they can care about it, care about water quality, and see why the river is an important asset for the city and the region. Creating a common ground for all. So thinking about how we can create more places for people to come together. So whether we're talking about older brownfield sites and rethinking those, but also just creating more destinations, more places for people to go. I'll say that one of the balances here too is a lot of the neighborhoods that we talked to, and especially in sub-area 2 and kind of the more downtown Atlanta, were very cognizant of gentrification and displacement. And there's a lot of fear, and is a lot of fear about what happens when a city comes in and makes a huge investment, and speculative real estate starts to drive up land values, and people get pushed out. And so that access then becomes much more inequitable because we're not allowing everybody to have that access. So thinking about those sorts of systems, again, I think is a piece of what we need to be thinking about. The ecology, which is a major component here. One of the, I think, funniest and most important pieces to think through is we can talk about the water health of the Chattahoochee all day, but if you're not thinking about the tributaries that feed the Chattahoochee, you're never really going to be able to address the water quality in a way that you need to. So thinking about tributaries from both an access but also a water quality standpoint was important. Enhancing overall ecological connectivity throughout. It's one of the more connective corridors throughout the region now, but it does struggle with a lot of different challenges with invasive species, both plants and animals, and thinking about how all that works. Atlanta did do some really kind of forward-thinking policy to the Metropolitan River Protection Act, which was put in place in the 70s, which is one of the reasons that it is a major kind of tourism component now with fishing and other things, especially on the northern side, is because of that policy that was put in place. It was very important to work within those jurisdictional regulations so that the river would continue to be protected, but also hopefully the project would help make the waterway even cleaner and better than it is now. And I think, thinking about how you balance conservation and access. You want to get people to the beautiful places, but you don't want to then destroy the beautiful places. So, that's a really important piece to this project. And then the living legacy piece, again, if it's out of sight, out of mind, people aren't going to care about it. They're just not. And that was a really big part of this project. How do we kind of get people down there to learn the stories? I mean, enormously important social justice stories about some of the historic spaces along the river, but thinking about how we're going to continue to build advocacy and stewardship for the river by making it kind of this much more forward-thinking legacy project for communities. We got to hear all these stories of people who grew up along the river years ago and used to go down into the streams and the rivers and catch crawdads or be baptized and all those things, and that stuff kind of went away over time. And so how can we bring that level of kind of connection back? I'm going to kind of fly through this, but thinking of it's not just a greenway but a blueway, also thinking about tributaries, which we thought of as both streams but also transit routes, other trails, how all that stuff really comes together to create what's known as the Riverlands. We had the good fortune of being able to work on, which I thought this is a really great case study, is they did the 100-mile plan, but they also asked us to produce a pilot project. So not only come up with a big idea, but let's test and figure out how this actually works on the ground. So in Cobb County, we were able to develop some different trail standards and ideas for what the Riverlands would mean. This is just one of multiple kind of images of the trail that goes through. We worked with the community there, but also thinking about public spaces and access. So here, an access point, we called this Cobb Beach. But this was about how do we get people down to the river? How do we give them access? How do we create a place for people on boats to be able to rest? But also, how do we protect the shoreline? And make it a stronger, more kind of ecologically functional space as well at the same time. And my personal favorite one was thinking about how trails, putting boardwalks through wetlands, but maybe there are moments where we can then use that as an advantage for education. Again, getting people to get down into the wetlands, touch and feel, and really appreciate what these unique landscapes offer, so that they can continue to cherish them and build that stewardship around these sorts of ecological systems. And in total, we ran a lot of stats. The amount of people that could be impacted by this level of access, by improving water quality, by providing healthier access to transportation. It's 1 million people that live within a 15-minute bike ride of the final alignment that was developed. You could see there were 19 different cities within 3 miles. This huge kind of number. There were a number of environmental justice target areas that would stand to have huge benefits from having their sites improved. And thinking again about the 128,000 plus households that live within that 3 miles that are earning under the median income of Metro Atlanta, so creating that access for people who might not historically have had it and might not have access to spaces like this or where this could become. So with that, we'll pull it to a close and open to any questions. I don't know if we've got any in the chat, but it's been a joy sharing our work with you and thoughts about resilience, and happy to answer any questions that you've got. Thank you all.
Yeah, there was one question that came in, and I apologize for not seeing it when I was going through mine, but how did the residents feel about the removal of the pool? I haven't heard anything negative back from our client. I think the space that they got in exchange for that was significantly better, and I think it's been more used. And I think it's definitely more of an amenity than what they had.
Yeah, and I think the maybe thing that we didn't describe is that the pool didn't work. It leaked. And so I don't know that the pool had water in it for a long time. And so it was more of the sort of fenced off thing that nobody used, at least not much, because there was never water in it.
All right. Anybody else have any questions that they want to ask either Lewis or Matt about the projects? All right. Well, if not, I thought the presentation was fantastic. I like the different scales of the projects that you all showed. I think it helps to a wide audience to be able to show the different types of projects that you all have been working on, and some of the things and that you're able to incorporate. Resilience at both the environmental level, but also the social level. I think that was a really cool thing within the presentation. So last call for any questions. You might have anything. All right. Well, if not, thank you to Gresham Smith for their continued sponsorship of APA Kentucky, and to Lewis and Matt for today's session. Again, this session is CM certified, so be sure to go into my APA at planning.org and claim your credit. You can either do that by looking up the number, which is 9206457, or just do a search for APA KY in the events, and it'll pull up the series. Please send us feedback on today's session. You can do that by emailing me directly at brian.davis@louisvilleky.gov. And then finally, be sure to join us for our last session, which will be on Thursday, October 29th at 3 o'clock Eastern, 2 o'clock Central. That'll be our Planning During COVID-19 Accelerated Trends, which will be presented by Lord Axe Sargent. So again, thanks to everyone for joining us today. We appreciate you taking a few minutes out of your day to come and learn a little bit with us. Hope you all have a great rest of the day, and happy planning to all.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you.